Shabbat Shalom, friends. Shabbos.
Shabbat Shalom.
So, we are at a climactic point in our Torah. It's okay. We're at a climactic point in our Torah. We began last week's Torah portion at the heels of a major pandemic that just devastated the people of Israel just before they entered into the Holy Land. And only through extreme measures and after separating ourselves and isolating ourselves from our loved ones and our neighbors did we overcome this terrible plague, this tragedy. And our first task at hand after this plague was to conduct the first official census of each tribe to see who made it onto the other side of this pandemic with their help. And then Moses continued to appoint Joshua to succeed him in leading the people of Israel into the promised land. The description of last week's Torah portion is perfectly metaphoric for the time and place we were standing in this room just a week ago. Rabbi Schwartz was bestowing upon me the rights of leadership of our community, just as Moses did to Joshua in our blessed history. And our first census, it was last week, and we counted mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, members of our congregation. There was 120 people in this room, and an additional 80 that appeared for our virtual service. That's a total of 200 in attendance. But one final piece needs to be dissected, and that's in this week's Torah portion. That's Parshat Matot-Massei. And it perfectly bookends our book of Numbers and also our metaphor that we began last week. Parshat Matot-Massei begins at this heightened state of suspense that we were left off at. And the people of Israel, they're literally standing at the gates of the promised land. And now, we've endured a plague, and we stand at an encampment just on the banks of the Jordan River. And we're overlooking the land of milk and honey. There's 42 encampments that are listed in this week's Torah portion that are along the Jordan River, which separates Israel from Jordan, from us and the wilderness. And we are ready and prepared to enter into the Holy Land. And we are expecting hostility, the hostility that we will face from our neighbors. And as each of the tribes, they are sharpening their tools. In one hand they have their knives and swords, and in the other they have their plowshares. The tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh, they go before Moses one final time for guidance, before Moses completely hands off the reins to Joshua, his successor. 3 tribes. They're standing and they're looking around them. And they're not enamored by the vision of the land out in the distance. And instead, they've fallen in love with the encampment site that's overlooking Israel. They've fallen in love with the land outside of Israel. You see, this makes sense. The tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, Scott speaking, they were pastoral herders of goat and cattle. And the land of the Jordan, it was perfect for cattle raising and for tending the livestock. Not so much today, though. And we're talking about a significant statistic. We're talking about 19% of the total population of the Israelites for this time. And they desired to live on a patch of land that was about 20% the size of the land that they'd been promised by God. Imagine a significant cross-section of people traversing years in the desert, exodus and miracles. And finally the devastating plague, and they're at the gates of the promised land, and they see in the distance, and it's not as bountiful or beautiful as they had imagined, and it's not quite what they needed. Moses, in Numbers of this week's Torah portion, Numbers 32, I think it's verse 6 or 7, he begins to discuss with these tribes and asks, are your brothers to go to war while you stay here outside of Israel? And Moses and the reluctant tribes, they reach an agreement. The tribes of Gad, Manasseh, and Reuben, they agree that they will come together and all support the tribes of Israel in their conquest of the promised land. And in exchange, they will tend to their livestock in the land east of Israel on the river Jordan on the bank. You see, I began my sermon today by describing how perfectly last week's Torah portion had been corresponding to our exact time and place that we were in this room just a week ago. And this week's Torah portion does not fail to continue with the metaphor forward, and it fits perfectly in with our analogy with the end of Numbers, and it completes a full circle. So last week we demonstrated at the temple something impressive, wildly impressive. We counted our tribes of Israel here. We had our first census. We counted 120 present in attendance at the installation. We have just about the same now for the retirement party. Yet something else equally impressive and unexpected happened. More than 80, it was 85 people exactly showed up for live streaming services. And in the audience were people from mostly Georgia, but there was also some people from New York, there was some people from Ohio, Alabama, we had North Carolina as well, and Florida. And internationally, we had two people join us, one from Israel and the other from England. These were classmates of mine in college. And I did the math because I like numbers, not just the book that we're in, but also the arithmetic. And actually 60% of those who were attending the virtual service were women, 40% were actually men. And there was a broad representation of age across a large spectrum, from as early as 18 all the way to over 65. And after our service, an outpouring of phone calls and emails flooded my inbox from our virtual guests. And it underscores that these aren't just numbers, these are people. And people tell a story. I remember getting one email in particular from Jerry and Gail. It was a long letter. It was beautifully written, and it was heartwarming. And it reminded me, physically distant, we can still remain emotionally tied up together. Our virtual guests, they were present in different ways throughout this weekend, testifying to the vitality of the hybrid model of congregational life, moving forward past this pandemic. Our hybrid model, it fits in seamlessly with our Torah reading of this week, and it bookends our metaphor in a perfect way. Imagine again, in our Torah reading, the tribes of Reuben, Gad, Manasseh, they found something in the wilderness that was worth keeping. The thought of throwing it away was undesirable to them. And it was frankly something that they needed to do. They needed to hold on to this if they wanted to survive, if they were herders after all. So too, in the wake of this great pandemic, we will have our tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh in our community. Some of our community members will frequently be out of state, understandably so. They'll be traveling and be living in North Carolina, they'll be in California, they'll be in Florida, or Pennsylvania, like my parents this evening. Hi, Mom and Dad. So too, much of our community will remain indoors when they're sick, and I hope they do for their safety and ours. However, wherever they may be, either at home or in Israel or Russia, wherever they may be, they can always connect with us in this room, online, and in services, and in phone calls. And just as the tribes of Israel outside of the land, they testify to a Jewish diaspora, a Jewish existence outside of the land of Israel in antiquity. Our virtual guests, they testify to the hybrid model's vitality of congregational life. Just as Israel has and needs a diaspora community, we also need a diaspora community here at Temple Israel. And when we need them, they will be here for us. And when they need us, we will be here for them. And they include our Temple mainstays. They include family members and loved ones. They are part of our tribes of Israel, and we must embrace them. We must do our part to remain connected to them always and celebrate them as valued members of our family and our community from now and always into the future. Ken Yehi Ratzon, and Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.